good evening, everybody. I'm thrilled and pleased as punch to be here. A lot of people are excited for this interview, by the way. I'm here with Josh Neal. Now, I got some history with Josh Neal. I've actually spoken to Josh Neal before. I've been following his work for quite some time. Big fan of all of his books, which we'll get to in just a second. In fact, let me just pull that up right here while I got it here. This is his Substack, Psychopolitics. Here's a selection of the books that we'll be discussing: Intolerant Interpretations, Understanding Conspiracy Theories, and American Extremists. But because I know so much about Josh Neal, I'm inclined to think that other people do too. Like, oh yeah, I'm getting Josh on. You guys know Josh. So sometimes I can forget that some people don't know who you are. There might not be a lot of Neal heads out there, but for Josh, I kneel. Thank you very much for coming along with us on this journey tonight.
Thank you. Your reputation precedes you, and I am as heterosexually gay for you as you are for me. So
I'm gonna get dinged for this one because I'm like, oh, I kneel as if he's a king. This is in a very monarchical fashion. It did sound incredibly gay. I knew it the moment the words left my mouth. We're off to a rotten fucking start. So we don't have the soundboard here, so people are following it along at home with the Blood Satellite soundboard. Play air horn 2 right there. This is an interactive show. We got Geo in the comments here. He's saying it's Kino already. What do you think? You're smarter than Geo? I don't think so. So where should we begin? I'm just going to say that my experience with Josh, I was a big fan of a show that you were on with a friend of ours, Tyler Hamilton, by the name of Euro Bureau of Literature, which will rise again one day. I'm gonna trick you guys into bringing that back. He was also co-host of the Jefferson Lee Show, beloved show with a beloved figure. And then you had your own show for a minute there. There was Psychopolitics, and then there was another one. It was another politics name, I think, or am I wrong? Or I was thinking of Theopolitics. That was Tyler Hamilton's. But am I missing anything there, Josh?
Well, my first YouTube channel was called No Apologies. That was before I got canceled. I did that concurrently while I was on Heel Turn, if anyone remembers that. I was Richard Spencer's co-host. I did like a quarterly show with Keith Woods and Joel Davis, and I think it was like a rotating panel. I think Mike from Imperium Press was one of the guys on that. Jefferson Lee was one of the guys on it.
Was that The Boys, or is that a different one?
I've been around the block. It was The Boys. Yeah,
there was this one. This was all up on Tyler Hamilton's YouTube channel, which got struck down. I don't know if you can find a lot of that anywhere. I mean, some of it might be on Rumble, but a good chunk of that might be lost until someone figures out how to re-upload all that stuff, which ain't easy. I understand. Tyler's over there in Rome right now, studying to be the next pope. So we wish him well on that front. We're all stuck here in the trenches, though, trying to figure it out. And I think you've done as good a job as I've seen of trying to figure it out in the American context. Now, I'm going to say something. You correct me if I'm wrong. With these three books, it almost seems like a triptych to me. And I don't know what you've got planned for your next book. But when I look at this corpus of books, it seems that there is a conceptual through line. It's seemingly explaining politics in a distinctly American context. But you started with an American extremist, describing the phenomenon of extremism. And you can't really explain the whole story of American extremism without conspiracy theories. So then you have conspiracy theories. And then you can't really explain that without getting into the psychology of the post-war consensus, which is what I believe the third one is about. Now, does that sound about right to you?
Yeah, more or less. It wasn't intentional. I think I just kept trying to narrow my focus over time. And yeah, the most recent book is like very nitty gritty on a handful of social scientists who, I make the case in the book that they are basically maybe not the most important people, but if they're the S tier list of social theorists whose arguments are basically ubiquitous everywhere. We were talking about Richard Hofstadter a little bit before we went live. And, that's not a name I think probably anyone thinks about anymore, but so much of his body of work, and I'm still working through his back catalog, Hofstadter's arguments basically formed like the core of like John Stewart liberalism. Like, I'm a millennial. I think you're basically the same age as me. Like, the liberal world maybe mix in some other people, but is very much Richard Hofstadter. Richard Hofstadter wrote about American gun culture, anti-intellectualism as like a conservative tendency. He wrote about, famously, he won the Pulitzer Prize for his essay, The Paranoid Style in American Politics, which is like the OG anti-conspiracy polemic.
I remember you were on an interview recently where you're discussing that word specifically, paranoid. And I love that because, just to interrupt you, on the show, we've covered quite a few books from what we call the shit lib canon. And I also discussed Steven Pinker's Enlightenment Now with my buddy Prudentialist on our side show, Do You Even Read? But I never really heard of Hofstadter. And a lot of people, when they think of notable shit lib books, it would be, Francis Fukuyama's End of History and the Last Man, among others. But you had pointed out correctly, and maybe we can get into this now, how integral Hofstadter was, and specifically how you described it. How do you describe it? It was him basically admitting the critiques from the right were valid, but almost psychoanalyzing them to say they were paranoid, and because they're paranoid, they should be dismissed. Is that correct?
Yeah, in the first pages of the essay, and it's like, maybe it's a short essay. I think it's under 30 pages or so, but it says created the language of psychoanalysis in the way that an art historian might talk about. That's how he was using paranoid. So he's like deliberately saying that he is abusing medical language, effectively psychiatric language, in a polemical way to smear, to disempower, basically what he called pseudo-conservatism. And the thing that's funny to me is the really effective Jewish social scientists invariably have a fairly large kernel of truth that they are fastidiously coding with layers and layers of shit. And it's true when he talks about pseudo-conservatism, not have been that, I mean, we're young guys, weren't alive and kicking in the 1950s, and 60s had been obvious back then that the emerging strains of conservatism were sort of actual and maybe really. But if you look at the last 20, 30 years, political culture, it's like clearly conservatism has gone off the rails. And in some ways, like the MAGA pop movement is kind of the pseudo-conservatism that he was critiquing back in the 1960s. But on the other side of it, he's using this psychiatric language and these neologisms that he's coining, like pseudo-conservatism, basically to paint a very broad brush with which to damage, and I don't even want to say right-wing sensibilities per se, the political concerns of America, which is to say hundreds of millions of just normal people, entrepreneurially minded people, civically minded people. The John Birch Society was one of the most effective and influential conservative organizations in this country's history. And I spend a lot of the first 100 pages of my new book basically critiquing the John Birch. If you were a patriotic, lowercase c conservative American, that was where the action was at. And it was a lot of very serious, very competent people who were just trying to find a way to do something for, and the fact that the people at the head of the John Birch Society, and even in general, the anti-communist movement, were sort of compromised in one way or another. Like Joseph McCarthy was wrapped up with Roy Cohn. The John Birch Society famously ousted Revelo Oliver for basically his anti-Semitism. I mean, there were major errors that the sort of radical right of the 1960s committed, but nonetheless, it was a vehicle for like authentically patriotic Americans, and all of these people, in Hofstadter's view, were pseudo-conservative.
You know what's interesting here?
Which is obviously.
So there might be a little bit of lag here, by the way. I apologize for interrupting. I can hear myself coming through your side, so it sounds like I'm not looking for a space to jump in. But it says his admirers say he's an iconic historian of the post-war liberal consensus. And it was just interesting that in the current discourse that I've been exposed to, you see people denying that there is such a thing as a post-war consensus. And you had made an interesting point there about how he's almost trying to psychoanalyze the right. And I noticed this. I remember in another interview, you had said that Hofstadter formerly was a leftist or a communist in his youth, then left that because he saw the excesses of the left. But I find that he's got a peculiarity that a lot of leftists have. And you had mentioned he's playing very fast and loose with a lot of this terminology. But that's something I noticed from leftists specifically. And maybe some people on the right do it. But leftists, they will appropriate esoteric, psychoanalytical, or historical, or like Zizek does this all the fucking time, frankly. But these guys, they hear a word they like and they say, "Oh, that kind of sounds like something I can wield against capitalism," or like he was just using psychoanalytical terms as like a convenience for political aims. That's why I view this very, very cynically anytime I see it.
One day I may do a more exacting piece of work on Hofstadter, because I do. It's emblematic of a certain type of Jewish public intellectual. Everyone's heard that phrase that's often, to discuss the persecution of Jews by not. But I don't know if this was for where it came from, but the idea that German Jews themselves as more German than the ethnically German. And Hofstadter is kind of like that. He is setting himself up as like sort of American history. That's sort of how this label as a historian. He's done this long view of culture. I mean, one of his books is it's the elimination of basically the transition from 19th century progressivism to populism to 19th century progressivism, and that's just one of the works that he this very long view on. And you do sort of get the sense that he does care about America and does see himself. He famously wrote a response to Susan Sontag criticizing her for basically her anti-white, often attributed to her. The white race is the cancer of I'm probably paraphrasing that, and he was critical of that. So he was not like nakedly chauvinist Jewish intellectual, but nonetheless, he his legacy is one of giving the ascendant elite to intellectually and culturally the rest of the country.
All right. So sorry, Josh. I'm getting a couple of notes in the chat. Now I'm not hearing this, but some people are saying that your audio is cutting out. It's not coming through on my end, but I do wonder maybe something is happening during the broadcast. If you can quickly, I don't know if on your side of the screen there's like a little gear icon. Open that up and see under the audio if there's a toggle for noise suppression or echo cancellation, and see if you can turn those off, if that helps at all. Yeah, so yeah,
I went ahead and make any difference.
it might.
Maybe I'll just keep chatting.
Let me see. Do you have any headphones, by the way?
Let me see. Do you have any headphones, by the way? Maybe. Hold on.
Sorry, everyone. I'm just trying to do with some technical stuff here. It wasn't occurring in the green room before this launch, but I don't think it's an issue with the platform, or if it is, it might be one of the settings that we have. But if it was a little bit of lag, I think we could deal with it. But I'm getting some notes that it's making it almost impossible to hear. So what we might do, we'll get it fixed right now, hopefully, but what I probably will do later is take the live video down, re-upload it, because on my end, I have the ability to separate the audio tracks in a more effective way. And I can probably repackage this so you can hear much more clearly the first bit. So we're going to see how this ends up, but I'll have to listen to it later to see what it sounds like on your end. Also, thank you for trying, gentlemen. See, this is the type of comment I like to see, everybody. Look at that. It's short. It's complimentary, it's deferential, and let me just see. Hey Josh, how you sounding right now?
So is this any better for you? Can you hear me at all?
Yeah, I can hear you. Let me just see if I can turn up your volume. Say something now.
Test 2, 3.
Yeah, I think maybe
This
we'll
is
turn.
Josh Neal.
Yeah, I can kind of hear myself in the background a little bit coming through the speakers, but I think we're going to keep going. And people in the chat, let us know if the audio is improved at all. So yeah, where were we? What were we just saying? I totally ground this to a halt. We were talking about Hofstadter. We were talking about post-war consensus. So continuing on with intolerant interpretations, you begin with Hofstadter. You spend, it sounds like, quite a fair bit amount of time on the beginning of it. Where does that book lead us from Hofstadter?
There's two halves to the book. The first half is sort of this examination of who I view as the most important of the post-war, not the most important, but part of the reason I chose them was in the case of, there's Richard Hofstadter and Karl Popper. He's been a punching bag on the right for everyone from Glenn Beck to R. Reno. I mean, everyone writes about him, but I don't know that people necessarily dug into his writing and sort of like excavated choice arguments and excerpts to show really how bad the reason. You were saying this about Steven Pinker. It's like, I can't believe you're a celebrated intellectual. These are very, very bad arguments. It's the same thing with Karl Popper. I see that they're saying the volume's a little low. So is this better, or are you not hearing me?
Can you turn it up just a little bit more? Let's see.
All right. I just punched it up all the way. So hopefully I'm not blowing out anyone's eardrums. But I mean, George Soros is, Karl Popper is an obvious example, because the legacy of the open society and its enemies is it's not just academic. In the case of someone like George Soros, who's one of these right man, the Open Society Foundation has played a major, major role in transforming the world, the political culture globally, towards one progressivism, open borders, anti-nativism, anti-nationalism. And Karl Popper himself mentored many important intellectual and political figures who all basically were like generals of the open society. So, and also Karl Popper wrote a very famous essay, an anti-conspiracy polemical essay called "The Conspiracy Theory of Society." So on the one hand, he's sort of like the arch philosopher of liberal democracy. He's the arch philosopher of the Great Replacement. He says towards the end of the Open Society and its enemies that it may be a necessary result or an inevitable result of this sort of policy of liberal democracy, dramatic demographic change. Text of liberal democracy is also not necessarily advocating, but sort of admitting that the Great Replacement is baked into the cake of liberal democracy. So it's like, okay, that's a good place to start. If you want to show that there is a long-standing tradition of demographic replacement as a sort of liberal political methodology, well, it's right there.
Well, it also sounds
And
to me, and you sort of touched on this very briefly there, that they've always had an antagonistic view of, maybe they had a different term for it back then, but conspiracy theorists. And we go back to Hofstadter psychoanalyzing the paranoid nature of their opponents, but it seems that their enemy has always been, in their words, the conspiracy theorist, the person who's looking too deeply, the person who they're trying to discredit by saying is mentally ill because they have the wrong theories. Would that be a correct assessment?
certainly in the case of Hofstadter, in the case of Karl Popper, um, he equates the conspiracy theory mentality to a sort of like Homeric view of how the idea that there's sort of this pantheon of conspirators, effectively. That if you're a conspiracy minded person, that you're sort of theistically minded, and you are attributing to financial elites, conspirators, so on and so forth, a godly like quality. Um, and this is something you often hear people say when they want to critique anyone that is skeptical to, for example, Jewish political privileged Jewish parties. They will say, "Well, you just think Jews are like gods. You think they are able to do everything and accomplish everything." And this is Karl Popper conspiracy theorists, that they attribute a sort of godly nature or a godly power to this, quote unquote, shadowy elite of people, um, which is sort of like a farcical framework to put on it, because you don't need to put on your theist hat to understand that people socially organize, and they socially organize in to achieve some end. This is one of the things that's sort of very painful to confront over and over again in the open society. He says that the purpose of democracy effectively is to not, is that it doesn't really have a goal or a that it wants to arrive upon, and that in fact having a teleological view, politically, socially, culturally, is like this very damning, oppressive, counterfactual thing to pursue. The open society does have a telos, and society is to abolish uh, native sovereignty. It's to abolish local cultures. And he says this over and over and over again throughout the book. But with regards to your comment about, if you're a conspiracy theorist, mentally ill, this is all throughout. Also, this meme that Richard Hanania puts out there of elite human capital and low human capital, that has its roots in Hofstadter's book, The Age of Reform, where he basically says, in a chapter titled The Conspiracy Theory of History, he says that populists are conspiratorial by nature, and they're conspiratorial because they're poor, they're stupid on the levers of power. So because they are...
There's been Hananias across time.
Yes, it's the multiverse of Richard Hananias. But so the argument isn't really an argument. It's sort of a class anxiety that gets played out. Richard Hofstadter wants to align himself with the ascendant liberal elite, and he does this by basically taking up the whip and castigating, for lack of a better way of putting it, conservative America. So whereas Popper is not psychologizing his opposition, Richard Hofstadter does. Karl Popper is basically just crafting a series of non sequiturs to demonstrate the illegitimacy of conspiratorial thinking. There's one important thing he says, and important thing he says in the essay, The Conspiracy Theory of Society. He basically argues that all of the things that happen in the world which we don't like, economic depressions, military conflicts, whatever, social upheaval, social downturn, he says that these things are sort of like stochastic. They are the unintended and inevitable consequences of some other action that we have undertaken. So, I mean, this is actually in stark contrast to not just how we have classically understood history to work, but how history actually does work. And when you put him and Hofstadter together, you've got two people who are basically trying to overturn what the dominant view, especially in America with Hofstadter. Hofstadter gained his reputation as a consensus historian by critiquing Charles Beard, who Charles Beard was one of the most preeminent historians in America, World War II. And Charles Beard had a conflict model of history, not in a Marxist way per se, but he basically took the view that the major events that happen in history, in American history, are the result of conflict between different groups and societies. And Hofstadter comes in, and while he's not really dismissing the idea that there's class conflict, for example, he acquires this title as a consensus historian by basically trying to say, well, the way America is now, it kind of has always been that way. And so the things that are happening in the 1960s and the 1970s are sort of the inevitable unfurling of tendencies and aspects that were always part of the American experiment. And again, in a certain way, we can say that that's true, but that neglects the fact that, first off, it just completely dismisses contingency. That there are unique things happening at any time, any moment in a given historical environment, and that the things that inevitably did happen were not necessarily prescribed. They didn't have to be that way. Any number of other things could have happened. So, but we ended up as a liberal democracy. We ended up as a racist society because, well, that was always the way it was ever.
Yeah,
it was a very
there's a strong undercurrent of inevitability that runs through that, just like we were mentioning before, Francis Fukuyama, End of History and The Last Man. And like we were saying, people tend to dunk on Fukuyama these days. He's sort of scorned in even liberal circles. Like I've seen so many speeches he gives where it feels like he's almost apologetic to the book, and he's trying to answer its critics. But I had found that End of History and the Last Man is a far more interesting book than a lot of these other ones. And I'm thinking of Enlightenment Now by Steven Pinker, where it's a lot of the same thing. And the more of this stuff that you read, you realize that it's really just parroting the same stuff, like Richard Hanania. There's zero interesting ideas in Richard Hanania's fucking ghoulish corpse skull. And the more you read, the more you understand the way he thinks, the more he seems like a copy of a copy of a copy, where the original image was a man's ass on top of the Xerox machine. And then after 1,000 copies, it is now a chattering, howling skull. That's Richard Hanania. But with Steven Pinker, it's interesting because he's also taking an adversarial tone against the critics, against people who say that, first of all, they affirm the post-war consensus while simultaneously denying it. They'll affirm it and say that anyone who disagrees with it is mentally ill or insane. And we discussed this on the second show I do with Mr. Prudentialist. But like, he starts off the book saying that everything's great now. We're living in a secular humanist utopia. You're stupid if you disagree. And then he writes an entire book with cherry picked data and very flimsy arguments to try and prove it. But there's something in their soul, in their essence, that truly believes that there's something wrong with you if you disagree. And I'm reminded of this great book I've mentioned a few times called The Therapeutic State by Thomas Zaz, who was a luminary in the world of psychiatry and psychoanalytics. And I believe you have a background in psychology. Am I mistaken?
Yes, and actually, the myth of mental illness was one of the influential. Was an interesting guy, Hungarian Jew, who a libertarian who, for better or for worse, advocated for deinstitutionalization. Kind of a mixed bag, mixed legacy there. But go
Yeah,
ahead.
there was this and I'm just extracting this from the book. It's a great book and we covered it on our show. But he points out, and this is obvious if you think about it, but although some people don't see it, that and I believe it was Dr. Menninger who was the head of the American Psychiatric Association, but he was sort of like the leading voice in psychoanalysis at the time, which would have been like the 40s and 50s. And he pointed out, and I think we got a quote of him saying this in the episode, saying that there actually is no standard for mental health. We don't know what a mentally healthy person looks like. There's no archetype. But we just know that every single person is mentally ill. It's just to what degree. However, how can you judge someone who's mentally ill if you have nothing to contrast it against? It makes sense, right? But then you realize, oh, this is merely a political tool one can wield so that you're inconveniently medically ill, mentally ill, whereas these other mentally ill people are, the type that we prefer. And then you realize this entire thing is shoddy. I know you studied this, so I don't want to be too cruel. However, I'm in marketing, and all anyone does is talk shit about that around me and to me every single day. So I'm pretty sure you must be used to it by now.
Oh yeah, yeah. I've definitely got a chip on my shoulder for psychology as a discipline. Um, so yeah, I mean that Soviet things feel today, where if you're not in conformity with the ruling ideology, then you are a psychological maladapt. And the role of of psychiatrists, psychologists, social mental health clinicians, um, as a sort of secular priestly class, noted time and time again throughout history, so I won't belabor it. Um, but to steer things back to the book, so the first half is really looking at Popper and Hofstadter as very, very important mouthpieces for liberal democracy. But the second half of the book sort of looks at the same issue of liberal democracy, the post-war consensus, social decay, if you want to say that, and looks at it specifically through the lens of, or through the works of three fairly prominent psychologists, all of whom published widely received, well received books during the 2010s. Jonathan Haidt, who published The Righteous Mind, Daniel Kahneman, who Fast and Slow, and perhaps less well known, but still noteworthy, Paul Bloom, American Jew, who published a book called Just Babies, which with the subtitle On the Origins of Good and Evil in Infancy. And each one of these books, each one of these specialists in psychology, kind of in their own way reflect tendencies of the post-war consensus, exacerbate tensions created by the post-war consensus, and have invariably contributed to the sort of cesspool that we're living through right now. And I feel a little bit badly about including Jonathan Haidt in this because the framing is very negative, the way I'm putting it. I actually think of Jonathan Haidt as one of the better public intellectual psychologists of the last few decades. I certainly view him as one of the more sincere people. And even when his conclusions or prescriptions are not really accurate, he's often barking up the right tree. And his book, The Righteous Mind, I think is a very influential book for a lot of people. It was for me. If there was two psychology textbooks that kind of like pushed me here into this space, it was the Thomas Szasz, and it was also Jonathan Haidt.
What do you think separates Jonathan Haidt from the others? And if it's his academic priors or his temperament, or what makes him better than the rest, in your opinion?
His work is less obviously ideologically motivated. It's less politically motivated, despite him now being sort of synonymous with anti-woke IDW type culture war stuff. He has always looked at specific issues and tried to examine those specific issues. So he wrote a book about, or he's written essays basically looking at the problem of social media and the increased psychiatric dysfunction of teenagers. Specific problem. It's a problem everyone agrees is a problem. It's not really a contentious issue. Everyone understands that the young than they've ever been, and everyone kind of understands that there's things about the social media culture that are really destructive. And I see you have it pulled up. The Anxious Generation is a good example of that. At the university system, you've also got it pulled up there, the coddling of the American mind. So he's looking at the problems that are out there, and he's putting actual empirical data behind those problems. He has bless his heart, he has this sort of stereotypical liberal solution of, well, we just need to do liberalism harder. That's kind of always his resolution, or at the very least, it's his resolution in The Righteous Mind. He talks about how there's this massive problem of hyperpolarization, and the solution to hyperpolarization is we just need to do more liberalism. Which
That's
is like
always
sort of incoherent.
And you know what it sounds like to me with Haidt, there's a bit more of a scientific or at least intellectual curiosity with him, whereas in at least in what I've read with the likes of Pinker and others, it's very defensive. They will say on one hand that we have the perfect system. It's called secular humanist liberalism, and all we must do is tweak it to make it perfect. Yes, it's not perfect, but we must tweak it. But they're very vague about what tweaks they would do. Whereas at least Haidt will say, well, here's the problems. Here's the problems everyone understands, and here's what we would need to do to fix them. Whereas everyone else that I can see, The only thing they would suggest tweaking is that there's too many people who are against liberalism, so we should do something about them. I'm not going to say what should be done, but something should be done. Like they'll, I mean, I remember in Steven Pinker's book, he was pretty upfront about it. Like he almost was advocating for education camps, saying like we got to get these people out of here.
Yeah, I'll say one thing maybe to drive this point home. Jonathan Haidt model of cognition that he called the social intuitionist. His model basically is a defense of irrationalism. If you want to contrast that with, or a Paul Bloom was a critic of Jonathan Haidt's. They are sort of these guys who are like, yeah, Enlightenment reason is the only thing that exists. And human emotions are sort of this proper with ever more exacting Enlightenment reason, TM, trademark Enlightenment reason and logic. There's like Stefan Molyneux or Ben Shapiro tier, like, we need our capital L logic. Jonathan Haidt basically says in The Righteous Mind, and The Righteous Mind is really a culmination of his laboratory work. So he's bringing his laboratory work to a popular audience through this book. And the social intuitionist model says, in only so many words, that there's a set of evolutionarily informed axioms or intuitions that we have through which reason is trying to make sense of these deeply evolved that we have intuitions. So his notion of the moral foundation theory is his way of defining basically how many of these intuitions exist, what they are, and how they operate. So he says that there's the loyalty intuition, the sanctity intuition, the authority intuition, the care intuition, the fairness intuition, the liberty intuition, and that these are sort of they're all in the mix, and they may find themselves in conflict with one another. They may find themselves cooperating with one another, but invariably reason tends to be a sort of post hoc justification we already have predetermined, right? If you want to put this in terms of Daniel Kahneman's model, Daniel Kahneman proposes that human cognition has sort of two modes, hence the title Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, that there's a sort of gut intuition, fast snap judgment that we make, and it's not really effective, and it's not particularly rational. It's very prejudicial. And then we have more of a slow burn system, and this is the reason, if you want to say it, reason TM, logic TM. So most of the popular psychology books that have been published over the last few decades are taking up this kind of fact of human irrationality and using it to beat. There's a famous book, You're Not So Smart, that was published in the 2010s. Or Dan Ariely, who published Predictably Irrational. There were many of the, Daniel Kahneman being another example, Thinking Fast and Slow. There are many of these books published since the turn of the century that all highlight the fact that humans are sort of dumb, emotional, irrational, and that they use it to undermine the reader's confidence in themselves as a thinking person. Whereas Jonathan Haidt turns around and says, actually, no. The fact that we have these deeply evolutionarily informed intuitions is a fact we have to affirm.
Yeah, it's not a bug;
Otherwise,
it's
we
a
will
feature.
Never, right.
And just to explain that a little bit, there is when you explain it like that, this is something I've noticed with these people. they'll say humans are irrational. They're basically trying to say humans are stupid. It's only the James Lindsays of the world that will say the quiet part out loud because they're so frantic about it. But yeah, everyone's stupid, which is to say that their plan was perfect. It's only the people that are wrong. If you ever worked with IT people, they say this all the time. So they were forced to say this when their schemes and schematics were proven not to be effective. So they'd say, well, I guess my plan needs to be as stupid as you are, which always seemed very petty to me. It's like, no, you fucking failed. Your ideas were wrong. It's not the people you deployed them upon. It's not their fault.
That's a sign of someone who doesn't understand what leadership is actually about. It's like a good leader who understands that when things go wrong, it is always, even if it's not specifically their fault, the role of a leader, an authority figure, is effectively in a not insignificant way, is to be the person. I don't mean this in like a Girardi figures, but in a certain way, like a good leader is someone who is the first person to say, yes, this was a fuck up. They are the first person to own personal weakness, shortcomings, because somebody has to be the first person to step out of that egotistical frame so that you can bring group solidarity together, right? And so when you have a James Lindsay type, like who's bitter that he was rejected by the peasants, it's like you don't understand what it actually is to be an authority figure.
Yeah, and the problem
Jonathan
also
Haidt,
is that James
there's
Lindsay
another.
wants to be cool because he couldn't cut it as being boring and stuffy. It requires a bit of gravitas to be truly boring and effective, which he does not have. So he said, "Oh, I know what I'll do. I'm going to be like a funny, witty guy," and he's awful at that. One of the great. There's so few pleasures in life, as you know. One of my few pleasures is watching James Lindsay just bomb in front of an audience, telling a joke that goes nowhere, complete misfire, a misfire of a joke, a misfire of a man. So to me, James Lindsay is this very special entity because I mean he hasn't figured out that he's a failure yet.
I'm reminded of that. I'm on Instagram and every third post is racism. I'm like, bring back the hot chicks. And nobody claps. Everyone's just like pin drop. It's like, dude, you suck.
Which is something that a man who has never had sex would say. It's like, hey, show of hands, who likes hot chicks? No one, no one actually likes quote unquote hot chicks. You gotta be specific. You gotta be way more perverted if you want to make that joke land. You don't got it in you. You don't got the fucking brain. You don't got the penis to be that cool about a joke like that. I'll say that to his turtle fucking face.
Yeah, it's funny. The other tweet of him was like, "Yeah, me and my stepdaughter checking out chicks' butts." It's like, bro, what are you talking about? This is absurd.
Yeah, that's what you guys do, right? We all have sex. We go out and check butts. I'm like, no, that's the better you are at scoping out an ass, the less you talk about it. You don't hear Navy SEAL snipers talking about how they do it. No, if you're good at something, you don't do it for free, James. You're a failure at looking at asses, too. By the way, and actually.
That's the about James Lindsay. Um, but yeah, so like Jonathan Haidt, these are basically the reasons why I'm like sort of cautiously pro Haidt, even though I think his book The Righteous Mind is wrong in very important ways. They're wrong in instructive ways. And this is you sort of like one of the first best thing you can do as like an intellectual or something like that, an academic. The first best thing you can do is be correct. But the next best thing, which is almost as good, is you can be wrong in a very interesting and productive way. And I do think Jonathan Haidt is somebody who is wrong in a very productive way. Because what he does point out is one, that intuition and human emotion is a legitimate dimension of human thinking and psychology, right? And two, the other important thing he demonstrates is that there are significant differences between liberals and conservatives, and that that it's not that conservatives are bad or defective or Nazis or whatever. It's that there are actual differences between these two. And so those are two, they're very simple things to state, but he said it at a time, and the book was published roughly around the I think just before or just after Obama's second term. So in the United States, this was like peak libtard, dominating political culture, dominating popular culture. It was like conservatives were constantly getting whipped, constantly having the boot on their throat, constantly being humiliated. And here's Jonathan Haidt saying conservatives aren't bad, and they're not even wrong. There's just something different. Where he started is explaining why and what should be done to ameliorate those differences. I would say that we shouldn't be seeking to ameliorate those differences. We need to exacerbate them to the extreme point of view. He says that the difference between liberatives is due to these psychological factors, which is an interesting thing to say. I think it's also wrong. And it's wrong even in the context of his own work. He says that, for example, liberals, of these 6 moral intuitions, liberals are unable to employ all 6 moral intuitions. That conservatives have an easier time accessing and acting upon the 6 moral intuitions: care, fairness, loyalty, authority, liberty. And liberals, basically invoking Thomas Szasz earlier, you mentioned, that's a good segue, because Thomas Szasz's book, The Therapeutic State, I think of as a pillar of demonstrating structurally why contemporary liberals are sort of obsessed with care and harm reduction. It's sort of it's a obvious consequence of the rise of the therapeutic state. There's a few things. It's the general trend towards the nanny state, welfare queenism, the therapy as a new religion, therapy as a new religion, all of these kinds of things. But that dovetails with a certain. Go ahead.
Also, I was going to say that you mentioned something very interesting there about one could also say that there's a feminization at work there, where the liberal, more than anything, in my experience, is about maintaining care, but also maintaining the status quo. And I remember, if people remember back to the Gamergate days, Josh and I are both old as shit, so there's a lot of young people listening here who might not remember this stuff. But I remember there's this term we all used to bandy about. It was cognitive dissonance. And there's this idea, especially on our side of the fence, that it's impossible to hold 2 conflicting ideas in your head at the same time, that you get cognitive dissonance and then you melt down, and you're basically calling people a hypocrite in internet nerd terms. But one thing I found in dealing with liberals specifically, it was always just forks in the road and binaries. Very rarely, if ever, does anyone, but especially liberals, hold 2 conflicting ideas in their head. In fact, the only people who can hold several perhaps hypocritical or conflicting ideas in their head at the same time and be okay with it is people on the right, and that's for a different time. But with liberals, it's always a binary. It's always, you might say, a great example would be during COVID, there's the George Floyd riots, and all these shit lib nurses were forced to be like, okay, are we sticking with the lockdown narrative, or are we letting people just go out and protest for George Floyd? And you would say, well, you can't do both. That shows the internal inconsistency in your worldview. They didn't see it that way. They just picked one. they weighted them against each other and said, well, for me, the George Floyd thing is more important than keeping up this narrative of a global pandemic where everyone's going to die. So yeah, just do that. And then they don't think about it. The only people who think about it are people like us. And they forgot about it. They just forgot that they did that. So with these people, not only do they not have cognitive dissonance, or they can't skillfully employ it, but they also don't experience it, but they also don't have any fucking memory. So for them, it's just whatever ends the conversation, because they just kind of want to, they're adverse to change. They're really adverse to true critique. And this leads me to my next question. And I apologize if this is too much of a divergence. I want to make sure I get to everything though, because I have a lot to ask you, but I wonder, and we'll mention your second book here, Explaining Conspiracy Theories. Is there something implicitly right wing about conspiracy theory culture? And by that, I would include libertarianism, because I would see libertarianism more strongly correlated with conspiracy theory culture in America, which is usually what people think. I'm not even sure if they have them in France or fucking Italy, but for sure, it's a crucial part, in my opinion, of American identity. And there is something implicitly libertarian or broadly right wing about it. And going off what I just said, conspiracy theories at their core are a critique on the system itself. And I don't know if that maybe that's why liberals and the left, but mainly liberals, are so adverse to it. Now, what do you think of that? All that shit I just dumped on you.
Before I wrote Understanding Conspiracy Theories, I read a lot of books by a German philosopher. His name is Peter Sloterdijk. And if there's one thing your audience takes away from this conversation we're having, it's that you should absolutely read Peter Sloterdijk. He's probably one of the 5 greatest living, lowercase c conservative philosophers on the planet. And I'll just say it, when I read his book, The Critique of Cynical Reason, it was almost like a religious experience reading that book. So having said that, why am I talking about Peter Sloterdijk? In his book, The Critique of Cynical Reason, he presents this sort of dichotomy within Enlightenment, the unfurling, the historical unfurling of Enlightenment. He basically says that today, in the modern world, and he published this book in the early 1980s. I think it was actually his first major publication. He says, in the modern day, when people give their reasons for any particular cause that they advocate or any particular desire that they want satisfied, that it's kind of obvious to most people that it's a naked, it's a very thin justification, which is covering up a sort of will to power. I'm giving you my reason for X, Y, and Z, but the reason is actually bullshit. I just want to be on top. I just want to conquer. I want to dominate. I want to feel so on.
This would be like academic agents' specific brand of elite theory as well, as far as I'm concerned.
Which I am, for the most part, with some caveats here and there. I basically agree with Nima when he does this whole BS, and then like that whole spiel of his. I generally tend to think he's correct, but he says cynicism is sort of like this modern. I hope I'm not misrepresenting it, because it's now been several years since I read it. But cynicism is sort of like this modern, twisted version of like the Greek cynical tradition, where when like a Diogenes went around and pointed out other people's bullshit, he was actually doing something revolutionary. And today, in today's world, when an LGBT person goes around, how oppressive, hetero, everyone's kind of like, yeah, but you got those guys in Colorado, like, you fucking ruined their business. So we know you're full of shit. You're challenging authority. You actually are the authority, and you're using this mask of like sort of revolutionary cynical energy. Really, it's just a pretext to step on people you don't like, right? So Um, oh gosh, I went all the way down this road and I forgot why I even freaking brought it up in the first place. Um,
Well, we were talking about, I think, AA's elite there. We're talking about the role of cynicism. And if we can just build on that, I'm not sure that I agree with AA's analysis because he would say, I'm probably putting words in his mouth. He might very well disagree with this. In fact, I know he will because he's just, hot-headed like that. He'll disagree anytime you say he said something, even if you got a recording, he'll probably disagree with it anyway. But I do think elites, as we might call them, are more ideologically beholden than a lot of people like to believe. I'm reminded of Peter Thiel, and we did a pretty big deep dive on Peter Thiel on our paywall show, Real Secret Coffee Hours. If you actually spend some time listening to what these people say, like they are true believers in, for example, transhumanism. His particular brand of Christianity that he's talked about in interviews, which is basically the type of Christianity that you would expect from like an insane gay transhumanist, which is that Jesus would like insane gay transhumanism. It's the type of Christianity you'd expect from a guy who looks like he just stands naked in a soundless white room for 2 hours a day, and we can never understand why that is. You know what I mean? So a guy who was like in shape but took Ozempic anyway, just weird things that I don't even want to know about. But these people are more, even with Stalin, when people say Stalin is this great Machiavellian figure, uh, in my reading, and Stalin's War is a great example of this. I know I'm not the first guy to say this, but there was nothing about what Stalin did that indicated he wasn't a true believer in the Bolshevik Revolution and in Marxism. He wasn't some Machiavellian, cynical power grab thug, like people say. Like, and to the point where I'd said, I don't think Lenin would have behaved any differently had he survived. I don't think Marx would disagree with anything Stalin had done. So I think there's this misconception that's like, oh, they only just say these things to the plebs. But I'm also like, elites can also be insane and stupid too. There's enough evidence of that throughout history. They're not just beyond spirituality or prejudices or I don't know, fucking syphilis. Some of them were born with syphilis. Like there's a whole history of this shit. Anyway, we're getting off topic here, but that's why just when it comes to the cynicism with which we can view that to me is almost you want to cast the elites as something other than human, which is something very plebeian. You know what I mean? Like a lot of the people who are into elite theory, I think, view themselves as elite adjacent. But you know what? One thing that aristocrats don't do, it's spend all fucking day talking about aristocrats. That's just a thought. Anyway, this is one big fat ass tangent I'm on right now.
well, you know what? To kind of split the difference, it seems Nima's critique sounds more true in the era of the post-war consensus. If you wanted to talk about or even the American revolutionaries, these were people who were working diligently to create not just a justification, but an actual system and worldview for what they were trying to do. So maybe it's not something you can say that is universally true of every ruling class everywhere around the world that has ever lived. But I think when people listen to like Chuck Schumer or Nancy Pelosi or Paul Ryan and they say things, you're like, I think you're just BSing me. But insofar as why did I bring up Peter Sloterdijk? Your question was, is conspiracy theory expressly right-wing phenomenon? I would say no, but it is an expressly American phenomenon, and that is for a handful of very, I think, obvious reasons. America was founded in a clandestine fashion. It was founded as basically the first major New World civilization amidst the backdrop of not only other existing civilizations, but decay, the process of being sort of swallowed up by like secret societies, like Freemasonry, like international finance, uh, like the international Jewish element. Um, so Americans are conspiratorial, I think, because Americans understand the conspiratorial nature of world historical events, which is to say, people socially organize to bring about something, and the more dramatic the change they're bringing apart, or the more dangerous the change they're bringing apart, they often have to do it in a sort of clandestine. Um, so that there was a time when there was a legitimate left wing conspiratorial culture in this country. I often talk about the 9/11 truth movement as effectively a left wing conspiratorial movement. Occupy Wall Street was a left wing conspiratorial movement. Howard Zinn's, history of the United States and the whole revolutionary ethos of the 19, I mean, pick the decade in the 20th century. You have the beatniks, you have the hippies, you have um, the sexual revolution, you have literally the American Communist Party, you have all of these sort of left wing coded social movements that were effectively engaging in their own conspiracy, and they were also propagating conspiracy about the powers that were oppressed. And I was bringing up Sloterdijk before was, when if you look at the contemporary conspiracy culture on the left, these are the things which are legitimate ideologies and not actual conspiracy theories. Like BLM, the trans oppression, all these kinds of things are sort of conspiratorial in the way that Sloterdijk, this idea of cynicism, sort of verbal trapping that does not have a logical or intellectual substance, but really is just a mask for a will to power. So, and the kind of collapse of liberal or left wing conspiracy theorizing, from my point of view, that happened when the left basically became sort of an unquestionable hegemonic power.
Let me say why the reason I brought this up is because, and I should qualify what I mean by conspiracy theories, because I'm painting with a broad brush here. So that would include, anti-Zog stuff, but also UFOs and maybe even Bigfoot, and also the Alex Jones type stuff. And the reason I brought that up is because, we've covered this on our show, the, very expansive history of, communist infiltration and subversion in America, and how a lot of their conspiracy theories and even Occupy Wall Street, I mean, the story of Occupy Wall Street is actually pretty interesting. Like, I think it became like a left wing movement, but kind of like the counterculture of the 60s, it began as something else and was co-opted, but that's what they're known for, these infiltrators, is co-opting movements. But I find that their conspiracies are always explicitly to undermine two things. It's either global hegemonic capitalism in zero other particulars, or just the American empire. Whereas, and this was trying to get out the libertarian thing, just based on my experience in dealing with these communities, was I don't think UFOs fit into dialectical materialism. And I don't think like flat earth and Tartaria or any of like the really trippy stuff that's kind of been in the zeitgeist for such a long time. I don't think it fit practically into left-wing conspiracy theories, which were explicitly just to undermine the American culture, American dominance, whereas more of that stuff might have been trafficked easier in right-wing circles, maybe because, as we have said before, I don't know if it's genetic or biological or whatever, but these types of people tend to be open to more ideas and can balance these in their heads. Like, you can still love America but believe in UFOs. You know what I mean? So anyway, that's just where I was coming from with that. And I'm not even sold on this position, but I was just trying to see if there's this is like the one counterculture that I think the left has had a hard time really co-opting, because like they don't really want to get into the weeds with Timothy McVeigh. I don't think, or like when they get into it, then you have to start talking about PatCon. You got to start talking about a lot of things that don't cast the left as the sole victims in all of this, which is a narrative that they need. Anyway, this is another tangent, but that's just where my position was.
So, in an essay I wrote on my Substack called Richard Hanania is Wrong About Conspiracy Theories, I basically try to give a very, I guess you could say, very narrow definition of what understood as a conspiracy theory. In my book, I posited my own language, and I sort of stopped using the phrase conspiracy theory. I used the phrase folk history, or a folk account of history. And to me, to describe a folk account of history is a very casts a very wide berth. To talk about a folk account of history means you can talk about Bigfoots, you can talk about cryptids, you can talk about fluoride in the water, you can talk about a eugenic sterilizing vaccination program, you can talk about Jewish finance, you can talk about uh, um, World War II as a false flag to get America into the war. You can talk about all of these things where effectively people are questioning the sort of received wisdom that they have about the world around them, and it's not even expressly political. It's more expressly epistemological, and I would say it's even ethnological. Um, Now, if we're gonna affirm the use of the phrase conspiracy theory, to my mind, conspiracy theory is the only functional way we can use that phrase, um, and apply it to contemporary politics or just political culture, is to assume a political meaning to a conspiracy theory. And so when someone is engaging in a conspiracy theory, what they're basically doing is uh, they're trying to bring about justice. This is the argument I make in my essay, that there's three parts to every legitimate conspiracy theory. That there's a question: who killed JFK, who did 9/11, so on and so forth. There's an investigation. Okay, well, there's the clean slate report. There was, the Zapruder was a Jew, whatever. And then there's a prosecution where you identify the guilty parties and you try to bring them to justice. You try to expose the conspiracy. You try to bring some basically you're trying to restore sovereignty, restore order to the political culture. And in that case, like cryptids don't fall into the category of conspiracy theories. UFOs don't fall into the category of conspiracy theories because these don't have direct political import. And when people are trying to engage in political conspiracy culture, these are the sort of outliers that damage the credibility of specific that they're trying to call attention to. When Candace Owens does, a 3-week long series on the USS Liberty, and then she turns around and talks about Brigitte Macron being Emmanuel Macron's father, it's like you've actually have stepped out of like proper political conspiracy territory into this sort of fantastical, mythical, carnival territory that is discrediting.
I'll tell you what, I love that though. I love Candace Owens because for a lot of people, that was their first foray into like black conspiracy culture. Because a lot of people don't know that. Maybe some of your followers, I know, a lot of mine do because I forcibly exposed them to this. But black people believe literally every single conspiracy theory in the world. If they don't believe in Atlantis, it's just because to them that reads as too white coded. But everything else, like name a conspiracy theory they believe in. So Candace Owens, she's done her best to make herself palatable to certain audiences, but deep down, she's a ratchet ass hood bitch. Like she's about to go off about how they're putting AIDS in the Kool-Aid. I can just feel it. And I'm glad everyone's getting exposure to this. I'm not surprised. I think this is a great thing that's happening.
When I was a university lecturer, it was in very urban parts of New York, Brooklyn, the Bronx, Queens, Manhattan. There were very diverse classrooms, tons of black folk, and I guess I was sort of the hip, by virtue of being like literally 25, barely older than the people in the room. I had a sort of like critique, and I did bring a lot of alternative views on a lot. Always devolve into black people sharing their pet conspiracy theories. Like the African doctor who cured cancer or whatever, Dr. Seppa. You ever hear about him? There's a whole conspiracy about
Oh,
like.
did I ever hear? I don't think I heard about that one, but I'm dying to know.
This is many years ago. I don't quite remember, but he's like, yeah, that guy. They got him. They got him. That nigga solved cancer. They got him. It's like a lot of that
It's
for
always like
25
it's
minutes.
always like vague on him. I love that. It's funny because as I've gotten older, there's a lot of inlets people can take into this thing of ours, as we might call it. There's people get into it just because they're outcasted academics. Nothing wrong with that. But then there's some people who enter into it just through straight up white nationalism. That's their priors. Some people enter it through conspiracy theories. That's probably closer to what I did. Or they were just post left types up until 5 minutes ago, and they're here now because all their friends are gay and killing themselves, and you can't have that. So they're over here. But I like the conspiracy theory types. So I've got a lot of background in reading deeply into all this stuff. I've given everything a shot. I found as I got older, I had less patience for it. Like reading through some of the most classic conspiracy theory texts. I mean, with an adult mind, with a coal head, old Truden's mind like mine, a lot of it's just straight up poorly written. Like I find nothing interesting in the Tartaria mud flood shit. Like I can't even be entertained by it. Forget believe it's actually real. But then even like some of the flightier claims of Bill Cooper, like a lot of these guys, I'm like I don't dig it. And like David Icke, like if anyone's actually just sat down and read David Icke, it fucking sucks. It's just not good. It's not fun. And he just won't stop writing the same shit over and over again. So I'm like, this is low effort stuff. And so, I do think conspiracy theories as such, I think the most insanely legitimate one is the pedophile satanic cult stuff. That's the one no one wants to touch. You get laughed out of the room for that in some circles. But to me, if you look into that, there's something there. However, everything else, so much of it is done to sort of fog these issues. But yeah, anyway, so I just found that, and maybe it's just you spend too long online, you've seen it all, but the crazier they get and the more ludicrous they get, I don't know. I think a lot of people are just numb to it at this point.
Well, I literally tuned out of conspiracy culture about 15 years ago for all the reasons that you mentioned. It's like you trying to find the one like not even reasonable per se, but just like the one coherently construct your conspiracy. It's like you sift through so many crap books, or people just like doing autoethnography. That's kind of like David Icke is just like keeping his dream journals and he's publishing it for the whole world to read. And it's like you just read enough of those and you're like, man, I don't care about this. I don't care about this at all. And it's like so unsatisfying. It's really I would love to a lot of the conspiracy stuff that I read in my teens and 20s now, like you said, with a cold troon old head, what do you say, cold head old troon mentality. Because like back then, like I wasn't sure and now I know what's being left out of like a lot of the important ones. Like if I'm reading about JFK or 9/11 or whatever, I know they're leaving out the Jews. You know, if they're talking about X, Y, or Z, I know they're leaving out this, and I would like to come back to it and maybe piece it together again. But just to go back to the question, like I've gotten so narrow in my focus that like the only way to retrieve the concept of the conspiracy theory really is to like blend in the Jewish question, because every relevant political conspiracy in our lifetime, they are basically front and center of that, which isn't to say like they're the only element, or they are the only group with agency in any of these events happening, but the conspicuous absence of this in virtually everything that's going on means that 9 out of every 10 explanations that you're getting for anything that's happened in the last 70 years are just not going to cut it. You know what I mean?
No, I agree completely. It used to be a lot more common to even bring up the JQ. I remember Bill Cooper in Behold a Pale Horse. He famously had to remove, I think, like the second half of that book because I think it was just reprinting the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in there. But no, I agree completely, and I like that you had to step back and sort of doing a meta analysis on conspiracy theory culture itself, which is where I'm at. And I'm working on an article for my Substack, the Vanguardist Journal. That's one of the reasons I was so excited to talk to you about this. You know, one thing, and because I wanted to explain or state this to you, see what you think about it. I noticed with what we might call conspiracy theories. I don't even like using that terminology, as I'm sure you know. That seems like a pejorative cooked up by the CIA. But one thing I had noticed is, like, I know my favorite definition of propaganda was written by Jacques Ellul, who defined it not just in the way Edward Bernays would do, which is just mass media control, but he said a truly propagandized individual, you can tell them because when someone's propagandized, the propaganda sits outside of their logic and reason. If you had to create a map of their mind, it's not subject to reason, but it creates a Pavlovian response. So, the one example I gave before was I'm Catholic. So I was sitting in mass one day, and I think at some point, this was been years ago, the priest, he'd mentioned something about homosexuality, is critical of homosexuality, and there's just this chill in the room. Like, you're not supposed to say that. Just regardless of where you are or what you might actually believe. It's the phrase, you're not supposed to say that. It's not subject to reason. It doesn't make sense, but you feel it. There's a chill, there's a tightness in you. And so with conspiracy theories, there's a similar Pavlovian response that I think was intentionally produced where people don't even want to look at conspiracies in the particular. And if they do, they have to explode it out into the universal or the general. This is actually how we started the conversation tonight. One example would be, we did a whole arc on this on our show talking about a lot of let's take Epstein. Someone had mentioned in here Epstein because I'd mentioned the satanic pedophile child sacrifice cults and stuff, which I believe is the most relevant and has the most evidence. We don't need to get deep into that, but let's take Epstein. What I find with liberals especially, but with everyone kind of broadly who is propagandized, it's that there's a drive to believe that someone like Epstein is just a glitch in the system. And you see this with a lot of child sex trafficking cases. There's this great book called Eye of the Chicken Hawk by Simon Dovey, which we covered recently. And a lot of people, when you watch the news, you'll see these cases like the Elm Guest House in the UK. They caught a child sex trafficking ring, and it just turns out that the names were judges and ministers and Senate members and chief of police. So there's always all these highly connected people. And then they say, well, that's weird. Huh? We got it. It's just a glitch in the system. Nothing is ever indicative of anything else. So if Epstein, they would say, yep, we got him. We got the one Epstein there ever was. And that's the system working perfectly. You don't need to think any more about it. But anyone who looks in the story says, well, he must have just been one in the latest in a long line of entities that are there for that express reason, which is to be a procurer or a sexual fixer for those in power. He's just the latest one. He's disposable. We proved he's disposable. Are you saying there's no more Epstein, you fucking fool? You know what I mean? But that's what they expect you to do, because to say anything else, that would mean that, well, that must mean that there are people complicit in Epstein being there, and then everything falls apart, right? But you must accept that there can't just be this one instance, but there is a drive within our culture, especially with a lot of the serial killers and these child sex abuse cases, to say no, it was just one guy, one lone wolf. And that great book, Aberration in the Heartland of the Real by Wendy Painter, about Timothy McVeigh, challenging the accepted narrative on Timothy McVeigh as the lone wolf, the archetypical loser, lone wolf terrorist. It's like, well, I mean, if you look at the facts, he didn't act alone. It's impossible he acted alone. That's silly. But what does that mean if he didn't act alone, or he was part of a group, or if he was there at the behest of the government? There's all kinds of angles to this, but you can't look at that. And you've been propagandized to not want to even look at that. You've been propagandized to want to think, well, there's just these weird lone wolves out there, and then they just randomly pop up and the system correctly finds them, and it distributes justice. So to me, that the problem with conspiracy theories is no one even knows how to talk about them without triggering something in them that takes it to the most like straw manning extreme, where it's a thought terminating sort of cliche in a sense. I've once again dumped a load of shit in your lap. What do you think about that?
Um, I'm not sure where to pick up with that. Well, one of the first things I thought, and it's not necessarily directly related, but just like a taboo of predatory, and like, and the higher up the hierarchy it goes, the more disgusting and abrasive it is. I did a show with Pete Quinones not too long ago where we read an essay by Laurent Goyenot. I have no idea how to pronounce that guy's name. The French guy, the French anti-Semite, where he's basically reviewing psychoanalysis from like a anti-Semitic point of view, and he's talking about like what's one of the many great controversies of the Freudian worldview is the fact that he moved at one point in his career from claiming that mental illness, not his language, obviously, was the result of sexual trauma, to mental illness was the result of a fantastical sexual experience on the part of the individual themselves. So, and there's many different interpretations as to what caused that shift. The story I had heard growing up was that he presented his paper showing that sexual trauma is the cause for all of this psychic dysfunction, and that basically, like the Vienna Neurological Society or whatever it was called, just laughed him out of the hole. And so, fearing that his career was over, he pivoted to this, PH fantasy idea. Now, the other point of view is that he intentionally made that transition not because he got mocked, but because nobody cared. There's a lot of different explanations, but the point being, what he did was bring a scholarly demonstration that there was rampant child sexual abuse within the upper levels of Jewish society. And it's like, okay, well, like that's just one of a countless million examples of like the closer you get to the top, everyone's kind of a predatory or a lot of people are, or there's an endemic predatory sort of mechanism in place. And I don't know if what I'm saying now is like fulfilling what you said about like going from the particular to the universal, but it's one of those hard things to just, it's just psychologically hard to wrap your head around, because so much of it does seem to, whether you're talking about Pizzagate or you're talking about like the Process Church and the Son of Sam killer, or you're talking about the Manson family, or you're weirdly the founders, like that was a conspiracy from like 5 or 10 years ago. All of these weird things, the Satanic Panic, all of these things that kind of weirdly seem to cohere, and the constituent elements always predatory sexual behavior, abuse of the young, affiliations with the government, some sort of like either breakaway religious cult or formal affiliation with a mainstream religious institution. Um, I think if I'm trying to make something coherent out of this, uh, it's there's sort of like a psychological taboo against systemic predatory violence that like makes it impossible to conceptualize any of this in any coherent way. Does any of that make any sense
No,
to you?
no, it does, and that's one of the problems that you're seen as weird for caring about it. A lot of people I know are subjected to that. Like, why do you even care about? You must be a pedophile if you care about pedophilia. But I think people want to reject the idea that this can come from a purely logical, route instead of some obtuse fetishistic route, which is probably what governs their lives. Um, but yeah, sorry, I didn't want to. I was trying to get through this episode without taking it down the satanic pedophilia route. But it is just that we had talked about that quite a bit on the show recently. And what do you think? Because I was doing a panel recently, and I know we gotta get going soon, so we can probably wrap it up in just a bit. But I wanted to talk about this panel I was on. It was we called it the Christian Pagan Synthesis Summit, and it brought together some pagans and Christians. And I'll just to briefly summarize it. It was the core message near the end was that and we referenced this book, The Disenchantment of the World by Marcel Gauchet, among others. And it was saying that both Christians and pagans and most spiritual people are trapped in such a liberal context that they cannot apprehend spiritual ideas like the ancients would or like their great ancestors would. They approach from a very logical position, even though they might be very, very faithful. They lack the psychological or even biological mechanisms to truly immerse themselves in the transcendent. We're a meta people. We try and encircle everything, step back from it, and understand it and dissect it. And I wonder, we had mentioned before how conspiracy theories or conspiracies as such are sort of a new they would say it's a new religion. I would reject that, but there's something there. There's a germ of an idea that conspiracy culture is integral to the American identity, and that the fantastical speculation works hand in glove with politics. And I just do wonder, and again, see if you can follow me on this. Like, do you think conspiracy culture, A, is integral to the American identity? B, do you see it getting, like we said, Candace Owens, more popular, more normalized? C, if so, is that good or bad? And D, I don't know. Like, what are your thoughts on that? Like, do you think this is something that will mutate in the future and maybe make more extremists, fewer extremists, or what do you think?
I, yeah, I mean, if I remember what you're saying correctly, I don't think I'd be exposing myself as an illiterate jackass. I mean, I don't know that there would have been a conception, a conspiratorial worldview in Benjamin. I mean, I think they just saw it in a non-pejorative way. Like there are powers in the world that are organizing things and influencing things, and we have our counter conspiracy, and there are conspirators over there, and there's conspirators over here, and we're doing our own conspiracy. I mean, I think there's just a practical acceptance of the fact that people orchestrate, they organize to orchestrate. Um, and so to say there was a conspiracy culture, I think there's a conspiracy culture now. I think then
Yeah,
people
that's more
thinking
what I
and
was saying. That now
organizing.
let's say it started in the '60s in earnest, '50s and '60s, and we've gone just to where we are now. It's gone to the point where if it hasn't happened yet, I can see JD Vance out there weighing on UFOs. Like I think the next few presidential candidates
Well,
will
Tucker
be,
Carlson
yeah,
talking about
yeah,
UFOs,
we'll be
talking
talking
about
about
getting attacked by.
interdimensional beings. Like Alex Jones shit is so normal. Like the career of Alex Jones generally can be seen as a transition into the zeitgeist of that sort of thing. Something. Well, what are the consequences of that? The consequences of the integration of the fantastical, the normal, where everybody's a fucking conspiracy. I don't know if there's one person that doesn't think that there's some kind of crazy conspiracy going on in America who lives in America. I guess that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah, well, um, so I don't remember if this is in the new book or the last book, but I make the argument that there were. I use the phrase suspicion culture. I don't call it conspiracy culture. I use the phrase suspicion culture just as a way to kind of describe heavily loaded language. So if we're talking about suspicion culture, we're saying the social forces that produce skepticism and paranoia and doubt, and this is actually like a subfield in sociology, so it's not just like my own cockamamie word. Uh, it's called agnotology, and the whole again this very similar idea that there's an intentional production of skepticism and doubt and paranoia and conspiracism. Um, so if you want to say that there was a suspicion culture of the 20th century, it was in response heavily shrouded, widespread transformational change happening all across the world, technologically, politically, culturally, and people were trying to get to the bottom of it. And like each decade of the 20th century sort of had its own transformational, historical transformations of historical significance. Um, if you want to go from like sort of the OG conspiracy material, it's was it 1913 and Jekyll Island, right? Into World War One, into what caused the Great Depression, into you know civil rights, sexual revolution, into the Cold War, Iran Contra, into Timothy McVeigh, Waco, Ruby Ridge, into 9/11. Like there are all of these sort of hallmark moments, and they all engendered their own sort of culture of suspicion. And in the 20th century, I think you could say, for the most part, in one of the books, I don't remember which one. I think it might be Intolerant Interpretations. I call it postmodern suspicion culture, and my argument is that it was sort of quote unquote conspiratorial environment because this was before conspiratorialism sort of became a consumer identity, before it became a commoditized product. And the fact that people now make being a conspiracy theorist their whole personality is an expression of the fact that it has become a consumer identity. Is that which is sort of speaking to the fact that more primary identity markers are completely out of touch to these. Same way that I could say I'm a German Irish Catholic, some people will say I'm a conspiracy theorist. and will take that on as like a social identity. I think that's where the more fantastical, bordering on antisocial sort of territorial conjecture comes from, where it's more solipsistic, it's more self, sort of masturbation. It's not even about uncovering anything. It's about a sort of endlessly speculative discourse that doesn't go
Yeah,
anywhere.
you know what?
It's not even
There's
like
one example I always give, because I do think there's a extreme politicization of conspiracy theories, in the sense of, I'm going to use a friend of mine as an example. His name is Johnny Monoxide, host of the Paranormies, right? And I'm not saying anything I think they would disagree with, but their byline is everything is fake and gay, right? So they accept everything. They reject any consensus on anything. So it's flat Earth plus Tartaria plus Hollow Earth, Hollow Moon, all of it at once. Every female celebrity is trans. I don't know. They're a pretty big show. I'm sure you've heard of them. And I've interviewed them on the show, and I gave them a phenomenal performance on Andrew WK on there. But many people love it. Everyone's talking about it. But even though I don't subscribe to those conspiracy theories, and I say that with the utmost affection towards them, I understand how they got there. I understand that, and this is what you're talking about, like a culture of suspicion, even if it's not conspiracy theories, but there is a constant rumbling suspicion of everything, correctly so. But if you've lived your life and you've been lied to, and you've watched the exposés, you understand the history of the CIA. You've been through COVID, you've been through everything. At what point do you just say, you know what, I don't believe in anything you've said? If you spend time within the dissident right, alt right, whatever you want to call it, you're big into revisionist history. You understand the fraudulence of the post-war consensus. So you're like, okay, how much of my everyday life is a lie? Why not everything's a lie? And until further notice, you need to reassert the basics to me. Guess what? You got to prove to me the fucking earth is round, because you've lied to me so often about other science related things, vaccines, whatever it might be. So like, even though I don't subscribe to the conspiracy theories, I do understand where they're coming from a political position almost, or an intellectual position. And I understand the demands they're making of, you need to reassert the fundamentals of this society, because you've lost so much trust with me, and I think more and more people are jumping on that bandwagon. That's where I was trying to get at with, where do we see this going? Because using Candace Owens as an example, I see conspiracy, the kookier, more fringe conspiracy stuff. Fuck, flat earth theory is an example. Flat earth theory is so fucking popular. It's wild how big flat earth theory is. So what are the political consequences of that going forward? Because I look at that, and I see people screaming out for some kind of legitimacy. They can tell something is deeply off in society, and so they've checked out of that reality. That's what that looks like to me.
yeah. I don't think there's a political consequence to that, because I think by going in this direction, and everything you just said, I basically co-sign. Like, I understand that people have gone in this direction. I understand why they've gone in this direction. I view the sort of antidote to that as a conscious, sort of methodical rejection or turning away from mass society. I mean, this rampant conspiratorialism is a fact of mass technological society, basically in its death throes, right? Um, or I should say, not that the mass technological society is in its death throes, but that it can be a functioning society. I think everyone's, like you're saying, in the same way that nobody believes anything. Um, I think most people sort of acknowledge that they can't even get their base from society as it is presently constituted. And so, to me, the solution to this sort of, and again, I say this lovingly as well, the sort of harebrained conspiratorialism really is a methodical turning away from mass technological society. I don't quite mean going Amish per se, but I mean like intentionally paring down one's engagements with the sort of trappings of technological society. Because if people are going to continue going in this direction that you've just described, the Johnny Monoxides of the world, and again, I don't mean that in a negative way to Johnny Monoxide. If he's who I think he is, I believe I've actually met him, and he's a very nice guy.
He used to grill post in our chat all the fucking time. He's one of our top guys, as far as I'm concerned. He knows his way
Yeah.
around a brisket, and that's high praise.
If for people to go down this route is to become depoliticized, and so you have a mass of depoliticized schizotypal people who I don't know if that's better or worse than, like, the generation that was raised on TV and was like similarly, maybe it's just one successive wave of technological depoliticization after another. You had normies watching TV, not knowing really their ass from their elbow and being herded in one direction or another. And then maybe you had another generation through Nintendo and Xbox and whatever. And now another generation through TikTok and X and Instagram. And I mean, I think ultimately all these things really are different forms of depoliticization, which is another way of saying like people losing their agency, and they're not even just losing their agency as political animals, but also as just social animals. They're not uh, engaged in a sort of process of creative production, whether that means starting a family or having a meaningful sort of work related identity or artistic or whatever, all the sort of foundational primal things that give us meaning. This endless sort of conspiratorial ideation is like supplanting all of that in the same way that marijuana or like heroin supplants a lot of that, or watching too much MTV supplants all that. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And I think that's probably the best place to wrap this up because I got to everything I wanted to get to. I got my spiels in, I got my big booty tangents in. So I'm absolutely thrilled at everything we got to talk about. I wanted to throw up your Twitter here to make sure people follow you on there. This is Josh Neal. You got to find him at Still J Neal. He's back. He retired for a bit, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, right after the second book came out, I just
Well, I said because I've listened to, like I said, I've followed your stuff for quite some time, and you're very forthcoming with all of your background information. We could have talked for an hour just on your experience in the band and your opinions on music. In fact, we had a comment from Rumble up here, and I want to get to it now before we go. Let's see if I can find it. He was basically asking what you're listening to right now. And I don't know if that meant, yeah, here it is from Tower of Bones, based. Ask Joshua what he's been listening to lately. He knows his shit. I don't know if that means music or podcasts or what, but if you wanted to shout not only your own plugs here, but anything that you've been liking recently.
I my girlfriend got me a record player for my birthday, and so I've been trying to get into records, which is actually really tricky because I've been just like a music playlist iPod guy for the last 15 years. That the concept of just listening to an 8 song record, 3 songs at a time or 4 songs at a time, because you got to turn it over, is like sort of like bending my brain a little bit. Um, but I did pick up Diary of a Madman. I went through a heavy Ozzy Osbourne phase like a year and a half ago. Ozzy for most of my life. And then I went into his back catalog and realized literally every album he put out until like 1995 was like a phenomenal album. Uh,
Yeah, that Ozzy's Lost to Time, that reality show really fucked up a lot of people's image. Kind of like Robert De Niro's later career. People forget like he
yeah,
used to be an actor, but like there's a reason Ozzy was synonymous with the genre, as was Black Sabbath. But Ozzy was putting out good shit.
there's just so many. It's like everyone. He had the most improbable collection of musicians around him. Great bass players who wrote his lyrics for him. Great drummers. I forget the name of the guy who played on uh, Bark at the Moon, Tommy something or other. Great, great drum fill. And like every guitar player he had, Jake Lee on the album is fucking seriously good. But
In fact, I'll tell you this:
I'm
I even
playing in the
like his
cover
new
band, so I'm
stuff. I
actually
even like Patient Number Nine. There's a lot of great songs in there. I know some people might disagree, but you can like the old stuff and the new stuff too, I think.
album he put out with Behind the Kid, and I was like, this is actually really fucking good. Um, but as I'm getting older, like I don't know, my learning that I'm slipping into boomerdom because I hear the new
Oh
stuff
yeah.
that's on YouTube, and I'm like, my god, this is terrible. Um,
Well, we're rediscovering
what's the
pop
group
punk right
called?
now.
Well, this is the thing that's weird to me. The music that people are starting to get nostalgic for is the music of our youth, and I didn't like it when we were. And sort of this like ironic rediscovery of Creed and Nickelback. I'm like, guys, this was awful the first time around.
I'll tell you
Um,
this though, I'm a contrarian at
although I do,
heart. Like I'm about to be out there and like Nickelback's fucking good. I say that I'll tell people that I've never listened to Nickelback very much. I just want to have that opinion.
that's the most contrarian it could possibly be because they were literally a punching bag until just about 5 minutes ago. Um, you know who I like? I like Tears for Fears has a good back catalog. Um,
Oh, we got one here from Geo. He says,
the
"Ask Josh if he liked the Portal album by Cynic when they had that female lounge singer."
Geo's got me beat. I don't even know what any of those words mean.
Geo, you killed the fucking stream. Thanks a lot, bud. We're about to talk about Motorhead, and you throw a monkey wrench into the train tracks here. But, but oh, here comes Geo in the chat. No Nickelback album. Kurt was, here's the thing. I got a pretty eclectic taste in music, which frustrates and enrages a lot of people. So even a lot of like they're rediscovering some pop punk right now. I'm like, I liked some of that. I got a wife, and she got me a little bit in a Panic at the Disco, their layer stuff. I'm like, okay, I get this. There's some stuff I don't get, but I get this. Um, but I also have a lot of metal in rotation. I'm not discovering older bands like I used to. I used to be really big into music, and I got really big into digging through the crates, finding old bands from the 70s and 80s and whatnot. And that's something I haven't done in quite some time.
I'm still doing that actually. I'm finding there's so much stuff I listened to when I was younger that I physically my stomach turns listening to it. Partly because like the lyrical stuff doesn't resonate with me, but also I'm like starting to realize like, oh, these guys like were not good songwriters, or like this is just like dumb riffing. Like I loved Soundgarden when I was younger, and now I listen to like a lot of it, and it's like actually Chris Cornell is not a good singer, and like there's this is just like clunky riffing where about music they wouldn't play it that way, So I'm finding myself continually going further back uh, like talk. I think my favorite decade now is basically the 1980s, and I almost don't listen to anything, regardless of genre. I almost don't listen to anything that wasn't produced in the 1980s. I love talk, even their pop stuff, but their experimental stuff is really really good.
I gotta listen to some talk. I haven't
But
heard about them. Are they popular now? Because I'm going to give them a shot. I was about to say though, do you remember? You're talking about Soundgarden. That's a type of vocal style that I was hoping would come back, and it hasn't. Where like that can make a comeback. That was a very strange masculine style that no one does anymore.
he, I got to see before Chris Cornell died, and I'm really glad that I did, um, because they played it. Well, for one, they played a bunch of songs that they don't ever play, and they were really, really good. I got to see Stone Temple Pilots just before Scott Weiland killed himself, and again, it was like there were so many recordings of them blowing it night after night because they were so good, and they played all of my favorite songs. There's this band, and I guess they've been popular for a couple of years now. Thing, um, Greta Van Fleetwood or something like that. Whatever the name. Um, it seems like the younger guys that are doing rock and roll now are like very feminine and doing more cheesy stuff than the gruff stuff. Um,
Yeah. Oh, I was even
or
watching
they're not
just one
even
of those.
doing vocal.
I was watching those music documentaries about like Metallica for some reason. I was just on a trip and I got this video about the history and the background behind the Saint Anger album, which is a bit different than the Some Kind of Monster documentary. And it was explaining how Kurt, they were getting into writing lyrics that were trying to ape new metal at the time. So you saw them talking about more like personal frustration and stuff, and it lost some of its rock edge that they would have established on earlier albums, even on Load and Reload. But yeah, there's when I think of rock bands that are doing it in a way that I think would be relevant to the legacy of rock. The only one I could think of right now is Queens of the Stone Age. Like Queens of the Stone Age might be the only cool band I can think of, and cool in a way that's not putting it on or trying to, or like effortlessly cool, and still cool when they're being supremely weird.
I was just James Edwards of the Political Cesspool was a Queen of the Stone Age album on the way back from that, and they still do have it. It's a shame though because John Theodore is their drummer, the guy from the Mars Volta, and I feel like he's severely in the Queens of the Stone Age. But they still got it going on. Um, well, here's what it comes down to: like, I don't even listen to bands anymore. I've sort of fallen into the YouTube rabbit hole of like individual performers. So like, there's like a lot of guitar guys that just do like fusion stuff. Like Frank Gambale would be one example. And it's like once you can hear guys who
Buckethead, of course.
actually, yeah, well he's like sort of a cartoon, but like once you can hear guys who can play with a fluidity in the way that you and I are speaking, I can't go back and listen to a guy like brutalize the minor pentatonic scale. Like I literally can. It's just like blow my brains out. This is like it would be like imagine if you went around and you could only use 7 words in every conversation that you ever had. It's just like who you wouldn't want to talk to that person.
Sorry, I got Vingul trying to crawl up my penis hole right here. Did Dimes mention Queens of the Stone Age as a contemporary band? 20-year-old reference. You fucking scarecrow of fraudulent cloth. That's not what I said. I just said they're the only ones I could think of now that are doing it. So you stand corrected, I guess. All right, go ahead, Josh. Sorry.
Yeah, I feel like if we kept going, we could keep going. So I'll just say follow me on Twitter, still J Neal. Follow me on Substack, jneal.substack.com. Pick up my books from imperiumpress.org and Antelope Hill Publishing. And Dimes, you're like the 10 millionth person to ask me about another book. There isn't another book. but I will take recommendations if you people definitely want
Well,
more
that's good
books from
because
me.
I
I
see
don't have
these
anything left in the
as
tank.
one coherent work, and that's what I was trying to get at the start. Like I do see a conceptual through line through all three of them. If this was it, these three make sense to me, read back to back to back. For a fourth one, I would recommend launching into a totally a new triptych, a new set of
Yes.
Joker's
Yes.
cards, if you will. So anyway, thank you so much. This has been a phenomenal talk. Big fan of all your work. I can echo the sentiment. Go buy these books. What I wasn't goofing when I called him a popular man. He's one of the best writers we got going. I think Antelope Hill, Imperium Press are our premier publishers. Nothing but good stuff coming out of them. So if that ain't enough reason to buy, then I don't want you living. I'd rather you go into the stupid fucker cubing machine. All right, thank you so much everyone for tuning in. I think we got all the good. No other chats to get to.